Captain Dustin Small Knight was an old man, sitting on a stump and chewing on a wheat straw. He was a halfling, tiny in comparison to almost every other humanoid known to civilization. Humans, the etalon of height and weight, were unnaturally large in his eyes. The ox looked absolutely gigantic. From his stump, he was observing a pair of humans who were digging graves for a group of recently dispatched ox. Neither humans nor ox looked so threatening at that moment. Observed from that angle, they didn't even seem that big, hunched over their shovels or lying dead on the cold ground. The small fellows. That's what the people of Anbennar called Dustin's adventurer company, and that's what stuck. Some halflings didn't care that much for the name. Some were having fun with it, while some just didn't have any desire to explore the etymological consequences of their stature. Yet Captain Small Knight was an obsessive perfectionist, and he chose to keep that name on purpose. After all, if your enemies incorrectly estimate your threat, then they let their guards down. Despite his kind heart, it was Dustin's cunning, his mental rigor, and his inspiring dedication which got him and his people to where they were now, namely, free. Almost 2 years had already passed since Dustin Small Knight himself convinced the Marquis of Arbaran to call for heroes and face the green tide that threatened what was left of civilization. It was the captain's pioneers and scouts that helped the Marcher Lords choose and prepare their riverbed of rotten steppe to face the seemingly unstoppable Orcish army under Du Canson. Scores of brave warriors died that day, but thanks to the work of the small fellows, humanity was saved for better or for worse. In 1444, the Halflings were exploring the ruins of Escann on their own, as so many other adventurer bands. At 71 years old, after a life of meek obedience, Dustin could finally taste what felt like real freedom. His only sorrow was an empty pipe with no tobacco to fill it, within moments of silent celebration. All he had was a silly wheat straw to chew on, and the hope that his people could survive through the coming winter. Freedom comes associated with many dangers. The Halflings found themselves halfway between Rotten Steppe and Lake Silvermere when Corin's resurrected body slayed Kogus Dukenson. Not too far from Arbaran, but far enough that they could count themselves as being on the front lines of Escann. War with the Orcs was far from over, but it seemed like the green tide was ebbing and that the Orcs were retreating on all fronts. Old allies forgot about their common fight, and each scrambled to claim as much land as possible, like hyenas rushing to devour a fresh carcass, a disgusting thought for a people with such a rich and vibrant culinary tradition as the Halflings. His defection from the service of the Marquis of Arbaran was essentially a criminal act, but Captain Dustin made sure to keep corresponding with the other Escanny reclaimers. These were all potential friends and future allies. 2 adventuring bands agreed to form a defensive pact. One was the Order of the Iron Scepter, a group that also pursued freedom from oppression. The other was the band of brave brothers from Ven, valiant adventurers, always prepared to help a creature in need. The small fellows had to stay on the move, unfortunately. Remaining in one place was incredibly dangerous. Even with careful scouting and human mercenary guards armed with arquebuses. Firearms were an experimental type of weapon and could only be used while standing still. They were not suited to protect foraging parties, and thus they would return with barely enough comestibles. A halfling's main weakness was their appetite for tasty warm meals, which were severely lacking in the Escanny environment at the time. Some were complaining that they couldn't continue for long with only 2 breakfasts a day. Others were lamenting the fact that they didn't sail to Bipek instead of marching east. They were right in a sense, but they all joined Dustin's expedition for a very clear reason. Bipek was nothing more than an overrated kitchen in a swamp. No kitchen could truly function without the correct ingredients, and Escann would become the granary of Halfling's dreams. Once the reclamation would be complete, the best fruit and vegetables would be cultivated on these vast and empty fields, far away from endless human conflicts in the West. Captain Dustin Smallnight held his last speech in 1446. He lived enough to catapult his people into an extraordinary adventure. He felt proud of what he achieved before drawing his last breath. And even if he remembered the fields of Tipney, he did not regret being where he was at the moment, surrounded by equally brave halflings. Hi everybody and welcome back. We interrupt this program for a bit so we can take a quick glance at the halflings and their history. This little humanoid race with incredibly high metabolism is not as numerous as some of the other civilized folk. Most of them could be found in Western Connaught and in southwestern Sarhal, in a place called Favanosi or the Summer Isles. The ancient history is uncertain, but it is theorized that the halflings originated from the Summer Isles and migrated north by ship along the western coast until they reached the Shattered Bay. According to the theory, some of the settlers eventually morphed into the gnomes. The rest settled on the mainland, and after centuries of tribal existence in the service of the gnomish hierarchy, they gained sovereignty for the first time in the 5th century after Ash. They organized themselves into petty kingdoms under the small country, one for each of the old Canorian halfling cultures. This state of affairs lasted for a few centuries, but was eventually caught in the proverbial crossfire between Laurent and Gawed. The wars of dominion between the two human powers put the halflings back in chains. Fertile vegetable fields and orchards became border posts between foreign human rivals. The last attempt at halfling independence, the Viswa Rebellion, occurred briefly in the early 15th century, but was crushed in 1423. That year marked the very few occasions where Laurent and Gawed cooperated. Unfortunately for the halflings, it was against them and their dreams of liberty. The former free city of Viswal, the last independent halfling realm in the small country, also ended up split between the two human kingdoms. The free city of Bipek was slightly different. It not only had a reputation of being run by corrupt politicians and cutthroat businessmen, but also being the source of the most delicious pork dishes, glazed in the tastiest honey known to exist. It was a fairly prosperous and prestigious city on the western border of Anbennar. Bipek had been originally settled by the gnomish hierarchy. It eventually became part of the small country and was almost completely destroyed during the War of the Sorcerer King. It broke away from the de jure small country in the year 1221 and finally found peace by joining the newly established empire of Anbennar. Bipek became one of the first electors following the empire's formation and would remain the representative of the halfling people within its borders. The Beefoots and Moonfoots, collectively known as the Imperial Halflings, cared little for what happened in the old small country. Furthermore, the only people who were truly represented were the city's oligarchs, the cynical masters of the merchant guilds, and their loyal mayor-electors. Being small and easily oppressible, halflings had to learn to rely on each other and on their non-threatening nature to survive. This comes as great advantages in relation improvement and cost of advisors with ruler culture. There are also expert farmers and cooks, which translates to a higher global settler increase and trading bonuses. The small stature makes them formidable scouts and rogues. Their disadvantage is that nobody really takes them seriously. Halfling armies are some of the weakest in Halan. Their slings are the only reliable weapon that they use. Their pony riders are a silly joke and their galleys are made of crepe pepper, which is probably why they rely heavily on hired mercenaries. Almost all their advantages come in the form of bonuses to mercenaries. I can imagine that sellswords would be more eager to fight for people who could not only provide the required payment, but also the most delicious rations in the world. P.S. I recorded this prior to the Valley update, which brought with it some radical changes to the halfling traits, which are less mercenary and more adventure-focused. Back in Escann, 3 decades after the second death of Corin, the halflings did succeed in reclaiming some living space for themselves from the monstrous orcs and sneaky goblins, with the help of Lilac war veterans and other hired mercenary companies. Renaissance ideas did spread around Anbennar, and through contacts made in Abaran, the small company could grease some palms and bring the new institution to their roving caravan. In 1475, the caravan finally decided to settle in Tiltwick, west of Lake Silvermere, and declare a country of its own. This land was claimed as a new small country, where halflings could once more live in peace. A new dawn rose over a new shire. Blood was, in the literal sense, life. Osman Kettlebrook, an elderly halfling of 71, pondered these words as he worked his tobacco pipe. The air was fresh and clean, tainted only by the smoke from this briar. Somewhere beyond his vision, he could hear the muffled laughing of his neighbor's children, just waking up for the day. How nice, he thought, to be young, to have been born after the wars of old halflings like Osman had fought here. How wonderful to laugh at nothing, to forget the old. Rustling Uncle Carter still hanging from the walls of every hurriedly built home in this corner of Halan. But still, despite his cynicism, he was thankful that those of his blood continued to walk these lands, free from oppression, for now. Austin Kettlebrook was a laborer of 39. He sat beneath an open window in his home, built directly into the hillside. He carefully sliced another sleeve of wood from his creation, a toy oak slowly taking shape, reminiscent of the beasts his father told him about. The beasts he himself faced, all in the name of carving out a home in those wild and tamed lands. Of course, the remnants of the green tide still existed in East Connaught, but sprouts began to grow across the once dead land where monsters used to roam. Harry Kettlebrook, a sweet child of only 12, sat on the roof of her hill home. The grass was damp and fresh beneath her. Her mother was resting one room over, and her father worked on a toy for her in the quaint little kitchen. As for her, she gazed at the horizon as the sun rose overhead. Her parents liked to scare her with stories of Escann's dangers, but there, in the peace of the morning, she found it hard to believe them. In truth, as the old company gave way for a new nation, only one thing could be certain: that was merely the beginning. But it also felt like they were out of the frying pan and into the fire. Newshire needed to make friends fast if they hoped to keep the people safe. The grey oaks of Frozen Mile were marching south and were dangerously close to connect to their green brothers from Castonath. The Escann had to band together and try to consolidate the western plains, and then try to push for the control of the white walls of Castanar and the Balgaric citadels. Despite the trials and tribulations they faced, many halflings refused to give up on their peaceful, cheerful ways. Newshire men appeared broadly content with their lot in life and happy, so long as they had land to farm and food in their bellies. Even the old adventurers of the small fellows had begun settling down, taking much more mundane and relaxing requests in place of death-defying feats of glory. The reach of Newshire did grow a bit from their humble adventurer beginnings, but their borders had to continue to grow before they could truly be safe. The area of Up Creek, alongside the fertile provinces to its west, were a perfect starting point for the fledgling nation. They sent word west and called in fellow halflings from across Connaught, eager to settle a new homeland, and the immigrants began to arrive. The future of their people depended on it. The soil was loamy, fertile, and free. The halflings were looking at its potential, and they saw a bright future. From all the ancestral lessons, one resonated above the rest: give to Halan, and Halan giveth back. To this end, the Red Foots had 4 tasks ahead of them: to till the land, fertilize and prepare the soil for the verdant blessings; to cut the trees, carving new fields and pastures for the root-cursed earth; to divert the waters into the farmlands, and provide fuel for the crops. Water was the blood of Halan, and the irrigation canals would be her new veins. Finally, they had to break the rocks and free the less arable land to renew the cycle. This, like all things that matter, would take time and effort. Contact to the bee peckers of Anbennar was the first real intentional diplomatic initiative. If trading routes could be secured with the rich nations of Anbennar, that would also help pay for the mercenaries needed to keep the farms safe. Dwarfs of the empire also began showing interest in the new small country. The halflings argued that together they could become more than the sum of their parts. so dwarfs were invited to settle in the capital province to add their expertise and resilience to the Shire. Resilience was especially important in those times. Fighting was not in the Halfling nature, but the new Shiremen had to grow in order to match the rising powers of Escann. Otherwise, they would just die. Like the small country before them, they had to be different. And in that spirit, the province of Silvervoord, where the northern White Wall met Lake Silvermere, the northern furthing of Dustin Wall was proclaimed, the first Halfling shield. With the success in the north, more and more immigrants arrived, rushing to fill the fertile lands left behind by the old kingdoms. Many were encouraged to settle eastwards, in the woods of Mariska, where the settlement of Second Tunwell was proclaimed. This became an important trading post on the roads between the lands reclaimed from the Greentide and the Empire of Anbennar. In the west, the old town of Hallandsa and the provinces bordering the Forlorn Vale witnessed a boom of Halfling immigration. Finally, in the south, in the regions of Vertaben and Valefort, the Halflings settled the capital of Tipney-under-Shield, confining the name of Shieldrest to the memory of human history books. The realm looked like a collection of countless villages, and there was more than enough room to go around. Across Newshire, Halflings had taken to building their homes into the rolling hills and dales that made up much of the local terrain. Most of the Halfling halls were surrounded by beautiful gardens and expansive farms. A land so beautiful was exposed to both roving monster bands as well as organized invading armies. The halls were not only effective in preserving the picturesque landscape, but also effective in keeping their residents safe outside the white walls of Castagnol. At the dawn of the 16th century, ever since the brave adventures of Dustin Small Knight, Newshire was still organized as a council of provincial rulers called stewards. As the realm grew in size, the world around them seemed to become smaller and more dangerous. The Steward Council worked fine for one generation, but in order to keep up with the times and to stave off the colonialist drive of the world powers of Connaught, a figurehead had to be chosen to represent the country on the international stage. The councillors met in Dustin Wall in the summer of 1495 to discuss potential options. They feasted and discussed for many nights on end. They reminisced among other things about the many traditions and joys that were remembered from the small country. One such joy was New Cobble Pie Festival, where the entire nation presumably gathered to sample the finest foods in all Connaught. Despite the name, there was more than just pies on offer. Pastries of all kinds, freshly made cakes, bread still warm from the fire. Truly a wondrous celebration of the Halfling appetite. In an interesting combination of circumstances, the council opted to hold a similar celebration at Dustin Wall. On the same date, the stewards planned the new organizational structure. If they were to schedule a voting immediately following the sampling, they'd sure get enough support to secure a legitimate election. Pony riders were thus sent to all the furthings of Escann to announce the Dustin Wall Pie Festival. The exciting news reached almost everyone in the realm, including a rather unassuming character by the name of Alder Kettlebrook. Alder was a middle-aged halfling of 33. There was hardly anything special about him. He rose every morning at the crack of dawn, pudding his way to his kitchen to make breakfast for his family. He watered his plants, smoked his pipe, saw his partner to work, and soaked up the morning sun before second breakfast. Some days he would read, either on his little bench or by his door, or if it was raining, in his armchair by his favorite window. Occasionally, he would try his hands at authorship, although he knew he would never find the same success as great-grandfather Conrad. Rarely, he'd visit one of his brothers. The only remarkable thing about Alder Kettlebrook was his ability to make an exceptionally tasty pumpkin pie. Some would call it perfect. It defied all logic. With just a hit of fresh flour, a sliced gourd, and a few other ingredients he kept at hand, he could create a dessert beyond all comprehension. He would get visitors, perhaps 3 a month, seeking him out for a slice. Such was the quality of the dish. And at the Dustin Wall Pie Festival, or as it came to be known, the first free fair, the crowd flocked to his table, sniffing out his pastries and devouring them in a matter of minutes. It just happened that at the first free fair, little Belladonna Underhill made a mistake. You see, She was supposed to bring the box of votes for the election to the stewards and the box of samplings to the judges, but she was awfully distracted by the colors in the crowds as she may have mixed them up. Alda Ketterbrook was not a steward. It was rather surprising then that Alda became the first steward. The ballots didn't lie. With cheese and delicious pie, the Halfling Republic stepped into a new age as a democracy where political power was delegated to the most excellent of cooks. The reform opened up new training opportunities. Every Halfling missed little things like the bright dyes of Viswal, the fine cloth of New Kobo, and the rich tobacco of Tipney. That said, with the land at their disposal and the ever-growing amount of resources, nothing could stop them now from bringing a taste of their old home to Escann. Everything they needed was imported and eventually cultivated in the home provinces, including tea, and with a little help from the patricians of Casternath, Newshire tipple wine. Life was good, and it kept getting better. The second free fair took place in 1508, which saw Sibyl Nevertrack of Dustin Wall win the contest and the High Steward's chair. During her time, Canorian explorers came back from the rediscovered continent of Elentia with information that proved the death of the main god of the Canorian pantheon. This information convinced the war-weary humans and orcs of the east to band together behind a deified image of Corin. The Halflings of Newshire also remembered their founding father. Dustin Small Knight, the legendary hero who led them to Escann, fought back the green tide alongside Corin herself. He may have been small of stature, but he deserved a larger-than-life monument. It was only natural that the Halflings would themselves adhere to the new Corinite creed. The Orcish hordes more or less reorganized into kingdoms and small empires, but they did not disappear. And the Halflings collectively remembered why they ran away and why they fought. This land had been made safe for a short while, but it couldn't last for long without an organized defense. The small folks were not warriors, but they couldn't rely on hired mercenaries forever. A national standing army had to be organized and assembled. Her land had to be made aware that even the shortest halfling can take down a giant with the heft of their toolbox and the cleave of their hoe. Even some orcish communities that remained in western Escann were recruited into what became a combined arms force, prepared to face whatever the future would hold for the realm. Not long before, Newshire was but a dream for a group of adventurers. With a new standing army and a new religious creed, it grew to be a state of its own, and one that had proven itself a member of global society. Generation after generation was born without even visiting their Redfoot, Bluefoot, Visfoot, or Imperial Halfling homelands. The Newfoot Halflings of Escann did not seek to sever ties with their roots, but they were indeed their own independent people, and they were determined to remain that way. A new culture always seeks to set itself apart from its predecessors. The Newfoots attempted to do so by embracing tea, importing it from elven merchants of Port Munas and doing their best to cultivate it in the imperfect soil. Another sort of cultivation was happening in the cultural landscape. The Halflings lacked a distinct language of their own, regional dialects notwithstanding. Moving to Escann and developing their own culture hadn't changed that. But all across polite society, a new method of discussion seemed to have taken off. Let's examine an encounter as an example. Marjorie Ketterbrook's sister Edora was married to Tommen Humbleleaf's second cousin, Arkin. It was at the luncheon between the two families that Marjorie finally worked up the courage to proposition Tommen. She leaned forward in her chair, about 30 degrees, 10 beyond what would otherwise be appropriate, flipped her hair over her left shoulder, and flickered her eyes towards Tommen's half-eaten scone, fluttering her eyes gently as she reached for a slice of cake. She then dug her fork into the corner of her dessert furthest from her, lifting it to her mouth and beginning to chew in approximately 3 seconds. To Tommen, and just about every other halfling at the table, her request was obvious. She wished to begin a romantic relationship, with the possibility of a heated sexual fling on the side, and with the endeavor potentially ending in marriage. Marjorie Ketterbrook made some rather scandalous actions that day. The detail of each was crucial and positively filthy in meaning, but nothing could possibly match the audacity of Tommen Humbleleaf's response. He tapped his teaspoon on the edge of his dinner plate scratched his left elbow with his right hand, sniffed once, and gulped his tea loudly until only a sixth of the drink was remaining. Torment's aunt, Linlan, was so shocked that she fainted. Marjorie's brother Marlin looked like he was about to throw himself across the tablecloth to wring poor Torment's neck, because Torment Humbleleaf had just admitted to an infatuation with Marjorie that had lasted many years, and a desire to begin the courtship that instant, and extremely inappropriately, an incredibly fascination for the delicate curve of Marjorie's soles and perfectly proportioned ears. Conversation continued in the normal spoken ways. He threw gritted teeth, but a great many tellings off and arguments ensued silently. For surely one could not truly call themselves a new-foot halfling if they couldn't notice such changes in body language, or divide their attention between their words, the unspoken conversations, and the expected eavesdropping on just about everybody else in the room. The third free fair saw Rion Bigwheat of 2nd Turnwell win the High Steward's chair. During his term, the new standing army was put to the test, both to the north and the east. Most of Escann was almost free of the orcish threat, but in the north, the Frozen Mile Grey Orc clan still posed a serious threat. The army and the hired mercenaries fought valiantly, which raised the national morale. The Newshire men were not shy to experiment with their crops. They had almost a century of toil, learning to work together with the foreign soil and grow crops almost as magnificent as in the small country. Almost. It all seemed to be ruined in 1532 when the skies darkened, as if about to rain, but only to open and release a torrent of blood onto the unsuspecting citizens. It looked like the end of the world. Within days, the Crimson Deluge had spread across all of Newshire. All the new crops were drowned in blood and gore. The soil withered and died beneath them. Harvests failed. People began starving, panicking, rioting. The nation of Newshire was not prepared for this. Was any? The sad truth was that the halflings depended more than anyone else on good and dependable rains. People started to think that perhaps this was some kind of message. Maybe they made a mistake somewhere. Maybe this was how it was supposed to end all along. No, there had to be a way to mitigate this apocalypse. Rion Bigwheat was a great cook, but he felt terribly inadequate in his position during the Red Days. So did the rest of the stewards. But in the spring of 1536, there was a knock on the door. A letter stamped closed with a wax seal, marked with the symbol of Newshire's fledgling transmutation guild. The organization was small, but had been very helpful with growing bigger, better crops. At least they were, until all of the crops died. As it happens, all the plants being dead had caused them a rather lot of trouble. My name is Layton Kettlebrook, the page read, Grand Master of the Chloromancy Guild of Newshire. To be direct, we believe that we have a way to end the Red Days. The explanation was concise, and all the chloromancers requested was the necessary facilities and freedom to continue their research, should it turn dramatic, difficult, or controversial. What else did they have to lose? Blood is, in the literal sense, life. Layton Kettlebrook, Grand Master of the Chloromancy Guild of Newshire, scoffed at this assertion as the fields shifted from green to rust red. He commanded his fellow chloromancers to pay close attention to the contradiction at hand. Days passed, weeks, months. The deluge continued to fall. The riots continued to spread, and then, without warning, news arrived to the capital alongside a vial of a deep red liquid and a sunflower growing in crimson soil. A breakthrough and a flicker of light in the red-hued darkness. As quickly as they could, the chloromancers put the experiments into practice with the full support of the state. Halflings from across the realm were organized to spread this solution as far as possible. Newshire was united, the riot stopping as the people found hope once more. The process was difficult, long and resource-intensive, but for the first time in many years, shoots of grain could be seen sprouting from beneath the earth. The chloromancers were focused on their work, refining their serums and preparing more every day. They heard the cries for help, and they responded. They would likely expect a reward, and the state was ready to provide anything they wished for. They were the saviors of the realm. Surely, there was nothing to worry about. Eventually, the downpour of blood had ended. Peace returned. People were sated and content once again. As quickly as they began, the riots and chaos of the deluge seemed to have been forgotten. Everybody seemed keen to put the rotten business behind them, except, of course, for the chloromancers. Though their experiments had grown rather outlandish, they seemed happy to continue them on their own estates post-deluge. Across the nation, they were heralded as heroes, cheered into every village they entered. Their potions and magics appeared ever more potent, and the crop yields had never been as high in all of history. Some people thought Halland's bounty was large enough. How much more would they really need? There was a knock on the door. Cora Kettlebrook, a promising young mage, the progeny of Leighton Kettlebrook himself, swept into the office, escorted by several of her students. All bore the Chloromancer's mark. Cora's was adorned with the symbols of the Guildmaster. She smiled tightly, a thorn hidden amongst a bushel of roses. "First, Steward Rion Bigwit," she began, lowering herself into the chair opposite. "I come with a business opportunity, one which would greatly benefit our darling Shire." Her suggestion was simple: an enshrined position in government, protected from the stifling oversight of the magisterium, in exchange for the continued support of the Chloromancers Guild. It was not phrased as a suggestion. The heroism of the guild was remembered, their magic was potent, and many a farmer had made her fortune using their elixirs and spells. To refuse them would implicitly cost the stewards their careers. Cole Kettlebrook left the office with the declaration in hand. The door did not close behind her. Left alone in dead silence, Rion Kettlebrook's heart sank. Then it started beating fast. He felt sweat in his palms, then on the tip of his nose. He sat there, in frozen panic. A letter, a door that should not have been open, a solution beyond the ability to refuse. What had he done? In 1537, the fourth Free Fair was held. None of the main contenders stood out that year, and Alvar de Gazer from Castonath won the office. Alvar had two priorities. First was to fill the kettles of the realm. More tea? It was an industry that had taken off in the past decades, and foreigners were clamoring for more. Steaming pots of Newshire brew would soon fill Halland's kitchens. There was a second, even sweeter idea that buzzed relentlessly in Alvar's head. The bees of Escann were capable enough at doing their jobs, but did not compare to the old, carefully bred bees from the old imperial home. His plan was to acquire some of the bee pecker bees and acclimatize them to the Newshire environments. But first, the largest small city of Beepeg had to agree to some sort of trade. After receiving a round of delegates from Newshire, the Imperial Halflings made it very clear that they were not willing to share the treasured source of their delicious honey. Well, in that situation, the stewards had to resort to other means of acquisition. Halflings are nothing if not sneaky, and eventually some Imperial Beepeg bees were stolen and returned to Escann. Lacking the knowledge of the small country, the local farmers could not be entrusted with taking care of the first broods. That responsibility was given to the clergy before they could utilize the insects on a nationwide scale. Things were progressing as planned. All was great. The Chloromancers did not bother the High Steward at all. He almost forgot about them. He received news that they established a grand base of operation in Sunvale in the southwest. The mages were nowhere to be seen. The Chloromancer slowly and silently replaced all of the mage estates across the rim. Hopefully, it was not the worst thing in the world. Halland giveth back, after all. There was nothing to do in response to the news. The door swung wide. The hinges were roused. A few years later, some disturbing rumors spread through Castonath. Something happened at Rohibus, the tea capital of Newshire. It was known that transmutation was an exact magic, and the slightest error in a spell could cause some devastating results, and allegedly, that was the case in Rohibus. What was known for sure was that there used to be a castle standing on a hill overlooking the town. There was a strange, unseasonal earthquake overnight, and in the morning, the fort had completely disappeared. It wasn't clear what could have happened, but let's use our imagination and, just as an example, picture a fledgling member of the Chloromancers who accidentally cast a growth spell through a particularly intense arcane focus instead of a flavoring spell. Then the target plant could grow rather large. Such a plant, squash maybe, would most certainly be strong enough to completely destroy the fort if it were someone nearby. Unfortunately, nobody would know for sure. Coincidence or not, squash-like monsters began being spotted on occasion here and there. These squash-kin were not hostile, but the halflings would still lay very much away from them. The sightings were mostly occurring near military compounds and barracks, so the general populace was skeptical of their existence. The Chloromancers' activities intensified on the western borders, in the legendary Cursewoods. With a few drops of magic and room to experiment, the guild believed they could make the woods into something more. The local population was instructed to either move east or out of the woods. Those who decided to remain were instructed to stay away from any unidentifiable vines or any exotic plants that displayed oversized pea pods. There was no cause for concern. The Chloromancers made it clear that whatever happened in the Cursewoods was going to remain there, but some of them had allegedly observed a rather strange phenomenon. It appeared that in certain specific, replicable circumstances, the previously static pea pod defenses were able to uproot themselves and travel incredibly quickly. Fully mobilized, they could be an incredible fighting force, especially if they were to carry the slow, clunky squashlings with them. Allegedly. Anyway, the Chloromancers, being part of the government in some capacity, began joining the free fairs as guests of honor. These events continued to be an important tradition amongst the Newshire men, especially after the Crimson Deluge. These were fun events where people could forget their troubles. The fifth free fair saw the addition of absolutely gargantuan fruits and vegetables, grown with a little help from transmutation magic. The winner of the fifth fair, Garlin Whitman, decided to purchase a particularly enormous marrow. The innards of the fruit were scooped out and turned into a giant bowl of soup. Nobody was really sure how he got the idea. Windows and doors were cut into the side, and with a drop of magic to stop it from smelling, a grand manor for the government to serve in was constructed. It would not last forever, but the giant marrow would serve as a symbol of Newshire's mastery over transmutation magic. One of the first tasks of the government newly installed in the giant fruit was to listen to several new ideas for improving the defense of the realm. The Chloromancers intended to help and sent several radical proposals to the table of the first steward. The Council of Stewards approved the deployment of experimental giant animated walnuts. They were slow to transport, but would spare the lives of countless halflings and allies in case of a potential large-scale war. The Chloromancers were shown to be correct once again less than a decade after the fifth free fair. It was in 1560 when the tensions within the empire of Anbennar came to a boiling point, and it erupted into a massive religious war between the religious conservatives and the Corinites. The mutant plants turned up to be incredibly effective, and the transmuters were hailed once more as heroes. The estate received all their praises and letters of appreciation, with quiet reverence and returned to their mysterious work. Life went on fairly uneventful for one full generation after the Great Religious War. The stewards found themselves in an unusual position in 1593 though. The Adventurers Guild were tasked to look into some rumors regarding a potential vampire cult in the southern provinces. After several months of silence, the Adventurers' agents sent a letter to the Steward Council. It described that the paladins sent to search for the vampires then actually encountered elder vampires and obviously survived. The only reason they remained alive was to send a message of peace. The vampires requested a truce with the government and the installation of the masquerade, a rule to keep their presence hidden to most. In return, they offered to help the state destroy all who did not respect this new treaty. Their request essentially asked for a seat in government. While being considered monsters, their extraordinary abilities and their wisdom was not to be underestimated. Of course, they had to be satisfied with ignoble blood offerings, which was a disgusting thought. The council discussed and unanimously decided to reject the vampires' pleas at first. The Chloromancers had to also be consulted. Their letter assured the council that they did not have to worry about supplying the vampires with humanoid sacrifices. They agreed to take care of that aspect themselves and voted to accept the vampires' request. They also argued that having such powerful allies was invaluable. With that, the vampires were allowed to have their estate. At the dawn of the age of absolutism, the lands of Newshire spread from the giant's grave sea all the way into the deep woods. The Escann Wars of Consolidation were officially declared. Escann was already almost completely under Halfling rule, even if battles between giant plants versus zombies would pester the gardens around Lake Silvermere on occasion. The magocracy of Esthil was long gone, yet their necromantic magics still polluted their former towers. All nations born from the fires of the Green Tide dreamt of controlling Casternorth, once the greatest city in Hallan. Though the Halflings didn't particularly care for restoring the city to its old lofty heights, the stewards would certainly find some other use for it. Devin Kettlebrook was the newly elected, youngest ever guild master of the Newshire Chloromancers. He stood atop a white wall in the late winter of 1613. Below him lay the greatest city in Hallan. The moon was hanging overhead, yet the streets were filled with people going about their business, making a light hum of activity fill the air around them. It was unlike anywhere else in Newshire. Interestingly, Devin had never liked the quiet. He always worked best with a little background noise, and the birds of Casternorth gave him plenty to think about. How much blood had Newshire spilled to reach this point? How many lives had been lost? Was this hegemony worth that price? Would even more need to be done to achieve greatness for the Halfling people? It was strange. Even here, above the greatest city in all Hallan, Devin Kettlebrook felt like he had so much further to climb. What he decided upon that wall remains a mystery. Remember that door? The government waged wars on all neighbors for half a century. The council was blind to see the one province duchy of Elikhand. Elikhand was the key to the end of the Wars of Escann consolidation, but Newshire fought on all of North Connaught instead. Oops, an embarrassing mistake to be sure. At least it gave one more generation of Halflings the chance to experience the free fairs. Closed doors swung open once again in 1654. It was a slow process. Few realized how many years in the making it had been. As time went on, the Chloromancers took on more and more duties for themselves. Command of the military, control of agrarian reform, foreign affairs. When was the last time a steward wasn't a Chloromancer? 15 years ago? 30? More? In the chaos of the so-called consolidation wars, nobody even noticed as the barriers between government and mage were fully stripped away, dissolved like sugar in hot water. At the Dustin Free Fair of 1654, there was only one dish presented, a mouth-wateringly delicious pumpkin pie, baked by Devin Kettlebrook, guild master of the Newshire Chloromancers, following a recipe left by some great-great-great-grandfather. Most didn't even realize his relation. Let's recognize the irony that the dish that won the first free fair was the same as the winner of the last. Was this always the path Newshire was meant to take? At Dustin Wall, the stewards and the Chloromancers became one and the same. Who best to care for her land than those who can give the most to her? No longer was there a first among equals. The College of Stewards would henceforth congregate only upon the death of their leader to select a new High Steward. The people were still allowed to vote at their little New Cobo Food Festival, but everybody was well aware that their choices didn't matter much. Still, the people would still get to enjoy great meals from across the realm. A new contest was added to the celebration. It turned out that there was no amount of magic which could prevent a marrow from rotting forever. As such, transmuters from across the land gathered to show off their magical feats in creating wondrous giant vegetables, and the winner would have the honor of supplying the next government building. The finalists created a giant gourd, a mammoth marrow, and a mega melon, with the gourd being voted as the winner. It was said that the Chloromancers of Newshire spoke to Hallan directly, and people were wondering if Hallan spoke back. Some terrorist groups disagreed with the mages and obviously plotted against the success of Newshire. Who in their right mind would resist their heroic wisdom? What was the mission of the Chloromancers? Unclear, but as long as people had food in their bellies and tea brewing in their pots, few felt the need to ask too many questions. Casternorth was unlike any other part of Newshire. Urbanized, closed off and covered with stone instead of farms. That state of affairs had to be changed, as decreed by the proclamation at Dustin Wall. Casternath's resources had to be spread across the nation. This was important, and the work to do so would take time. Some people would be overdramatic and act out of rejection of what they saw as a destruction of their homes and livelihoods, but their anger would eventually subside. People who did not speak to her land did not always understand or accept the mission. They didn't have to understand. All they had to do was obey. The state had to make sure that the people would at least behave if they refused to be educated. A series of magical towers were erected across the new territories to serve as the eyes of the government. They were necessary to guide the populace towards acceptance and cooperation with the mission. An experimental elixir, a miscast spell, a simple pumpkin seed caught in the crossfire. The worst disaster Newshire had ever seen. In their work, the Chloromancers turned the city of Casternath into a home for a magnificently verdant seed. Sometime in the spring of 1568, the Verdant Seed had suddenly grown to the size of a castle. Great roots dug deep into the ground, and rumbling from their growth could be felt across the nation. Vines and ivy covered freshly toiled soils in hours, and that was before the beasts arrived. Monsters of twisted bark and swarms of razor-toothed sprouts. Was that the price they had to pay for progress? The cost of success, of prosperity? Did they give it too much? They should never have opened that damn door. Nature itself, her land's living tissue, rose up against civilization, assaulting every breathing being to the panic and terror of all humanoids in Newshire. Occasionally, a particularly epic floral beast would uproot itself, bringing with it its swarm of sharp-toothed seedlings. Affected provinces were quickly evacuated, and the army had to intervene to cut down and burn the monsters before they grew even stronger. What can one do when their own food decides to consume them instead? In the darkest of hours, there was another knock at the door. Ella Kettlebrook, the sister of the first High Steward and a powerful mage in her own right, stood on the threshold. In her hands, she held a map, and she was dressed in traveling clothes. "I have a plan," she announced, tilting her chin up. "You won't like it, but it's our best chance." She detailed a journey, first to the Magisterium to seek their treasure knowledge, then, should that prove fruitless, to Halles, where the spirits of the land were said to walk amongst men. Fanciful, but she was correct. Outside the giant marrow, another riot could be heard. Ella's proposal gave the steward some sort of hope, and with that she was dispatched in a hurry. Nobody in Escann wished to engage with the Magisters. Their stifling rules prevented magical success. Although, looking at Newshire's current situation, perhaps they could have done well with some rules of their own. Standing before them, ready to drop to their knees after such a long period of independence was really quite embarrassing. The Magisters sneered and laughed. They had fun at the Halflings' expense, knowing they wouldn't be visiting without a good reason. Yet the Magisterium would not deny help to a populace in peril. Ella proved herself a stalwart young woman, keeping her head held high, except when she had to bow her thanks. She obtained a writ of entry to the Moon Mount Library, and she was going to put it to good use. Reaching the library was no easy task, but Ella made the climb over and over again, spending days searching through each page, desperately seeking a solution. But she found nothing. The disaster was the making of the Chloromancers. It was somewhat fulfilling to hear that none had ever progressed as far with vivomancy as they had, but it was hardly the time. Regardless, Ella refused to be deterred and eventually set off on a longer journey to Halles. In the meantime, the Halflings and their allies battled the floral monsters all across the realm, feeding the soil with their own blood. Months later, her expedition reached Mindanan. The locals, when translated, spoke of this place with awe. The temples here were incredible, rising out of the jungle canopies towards the sky, and yet, standing there, every halfling felt a strange sense of being grounded, as if Halan herself was standing next to them. Ella entered one of the temples alone, bringing nothing but the clothes on her back, a pot of tea laced with sleeping draught, a notebook, and a pencil. She slept, but didn't dream. Instead, she spoke. "Is anybody here with me?" "I have always been with you, halfling." "I come seeking aid. The Verdant, I know what you seek. Tell me, child, One makes one form of life different to another. Would I not love you all the same? I don't understand. Not yet, but you will, if only you speak to it as you speak to me. Ella left the temple with a complex-looking potion scrawled in her notebook, and her party set off the road home. Back in Newshire, she traveled from province to province for weeks, seeking mysterious experiments. Eventually, she and her entourage stopped at the white walls of Castanor. Ella drank a potion. The Verdant Seed loomed above her. She blinked and then awoke like from a dream and stood silent, thoughtful. The seed was the same as it was, but something seemed different about it. A shift in the air, perhaps? Over the coming days, the roots and vines began to recede, shrinking just behind the ruined walls of Castanor. Ella remained quiet on the matter, only saying that she had a chat with the Verdant Seed. Whatever that meant, whatever it was, it seemed to have worked. Blood is, in the literal sense, life. Much blood had been spilled by this instance of life, and as such, the old contradiction remained true. Ella Kettlebrook had opted to remain in Castanor, acting as the city's sole permanent inhabitant. The Chloromancers still studied the Verdant Seed and its offspring, but only from their safety of their laboratories, built in carefully selected locations in the area. None would forget the Verdant Seed anytime soon, and none would forget her land's wrath against their hubris. Perhaps they should have known better, or perhaps that was just one of her lessons. The halfling stared death in the eyes and showed it life. But in the end, all flesh is grass.
Oh, excuse me, I had something in my throat for the last hour or so. I just couldn't get it out, but I'm fine now. That was more or less the complete story of Newshire. A wonderful option for a fairly tall and relaxed game. An excellent story which spans multiple ages. Even though some parts are locked behind certain events, the pace seemed very well balanced in my game. Aside from the cooking-based democracy, which turns into a witch-king-chef-mage oligarchy, the campaign rewards are mostly flavorful in nature, but some of their unique mercenary companies have very cool applications. I like the way the Walnuts and the Sunwatchers work together, one being very fast-moving and the other being very good at sieging forts. These Sunflower Warriors can be recruited after the Verdant Seed disaster and reduce devastation in the provinces they are present in, which is a very neat effect. Newshire's mission tree is extensive, but geographically contained to central western Escann. The campaign can easily transition in later stages to the small country, as the new Foots are in the same cultural group as the Canori Halflings. The small country is a formidable nation which sports a decent number of missions. They mostly give economic rewards and encourage the destruction of old enemies of the Halflings, like Laurent, Gaved, the Reavers and the Gnomes. It is a pretty old mission tree, so it's not particularly exciting, but it is functional, which are replaced with a personal quest to conquer the Summer Islands and changing main culture to Sarhali Halflings. Unfortunately, I couldn't continue the campaign by forming the Summer Isles nation, but all my post-Newshire gameplay is a testament to my enjoyment of the campaign. I was ready to do anything to spend a bit more time with the hungry rascals and their floral overlords. Thank you all for sticking around, especially the members and Patreons. And apologies for the long silence, but I had some difficulties mobilizing to work on these videos lately. I can't wait to share with you some adventures from the Forbidden Valley patch. Until then, toodaloo.